Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. May I have your attention, please? This is a very nice day outside. It's spring, and probably summer will be coming much sooner than most of us might expect. This is the 32nd meeting of the Societas Koreana lecture, which is hosted by the Academy of Korean Studies. My name is Professor Kim Byung-gi, and I teach at Korea University. And I was asked to join this board of this meeting about 2 years ago by the chairman of the Academy of Korean Studies. And I have the very distinct pleasure of coming here and meeting with ambassadors from the scientific community and also from the banking sector from different countries and regions. Quite an honor and a great pleasure for me to interact with you. And today I have an extremely special guest who is going to connect you with the topic which I believe is here called, very interesting, Becoming Korean. Korea, the West, and the Construction of Modern Korean Identity, which I'm sure for diplomats and for the financial community and academic scholars, it's very interesting how you can kind of penetrate Korean society and to look into this order. Before he delivers a lecture, I'd like to introduce Professor Hahm Chaibong, whom I have known for over actually 3 generations, a very unusual scholar and a public diplomat. Professor Ham's family was born in the northern part of Korea, has had an extremely distinguished public service, serving as the vice president of this country. I believe after my paternal grandfather served also as vice president of this country. And then his father, who was a professor of international law at Yonsei University, is the one who introduced the East Asian Confucian legal order into the Western society, after which he became head of the presidential apparatus and served as ambassador to the United States. And continuing on that tradition of introducing and engaging the West, Professor Hahm graduated from Carleton University and with a degree in political philosophy. And he is currently the president of the extremely prestigious Asan Institute for Policy Studies in Korea, which is one of the leading think tanks that engages both the diplomatic and the paradiplomatic actors from every corners of the world. Prior to which he was a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation in Santa Monica in California, prior to which he was a professor of international relations at the University of Southern California School of International Relations, where he also headed the Korean Studies Institute. He has many, many very distinguished positions, but he's actually known globally in the areas of comparative democracy and also in terms of Confucianism. He's edited a book with Daniel Bell of Harvard University entitled Confucianism for the Modern World. So if you like to learn about Korea, both from a diplomatic, cultural, or academic, or even business enterprise, I suggest you very strongly to outreach Professor Hahm. So why don't we give a very warm round of applause to Professor Hahm and also for all of our guests here today. Thank you very much.
That wonderful, totally undeserved introduction. It's truly an honor to be here today. It's a pleasure. One thing is that I'm afraid of is that there are many of you that I've met before, that I've spoken to before, and I just hope that I don't repeat myself completely this evening. But this isn't actually a topic that is very dear to my heart. It really does mesh with my own search for my own identity as well as a Korean. It turns out, as a political theorist, as a historian, um, uh, and also living abroad from very early on, this notion of identity was very, very important to me. I still remember the first time I went to the United States was when I was in third grade in elementary school, and that was in 1966. Don't do the calculations, but anyway, so in 1966, imagine I was in New Haven. My father was a Fulbright scholar to Yale, and so we were living in a Yale graduate student dormitory, and I was going to school nearby. And of course, all the kids that I meet, they would all say, Chinese, Chinese. They didn't even say, maybe they said Japanese. I'm not even sure they knew who Japanese were even then, but certainly, and then I would say, no, I'm not, and I'm Korean, and that actually just befuddled them even more because they didn't even know what actually Korea was. Things have changed much, but I think that sort of encounter with trying to explain myself actually then forced me to try to explain myself to myself, and this is part of my journey, but it's actually, of course, as a political scientist, it's a very political version of what I think being Korean really means. And I titled it Becoming Korean because I really think that even as we speak, the Korean identity, identity per se is always in construction. There's never a permanent identity. But there's a sense in which the modern Korean identity is very much being constructed today, even now. And I think it started for the Korean people. One of the things that I always was struck by was that there was one conference that I went to about 15, 20 years ago. And one professor, it was an American professor who actually noted this to me, and he said, in English, when we say Korean, we say South Korea, North Korea, Korean Americans, Korean Japanese, Korean Russian, you can say Korean everything. But then in Korean, there's no word for Korean. And then he started saying, okay, what do South Koreans call themselves? 한국 사람. What do North Koreans call themselves? 조선 사람. What are the Koreans in America called? They're called 재미교포. They just live. There are, I don't know how to even translate it. So Koreans in Japan, they're 제일교포, right? And what about the ethnic Koreans in China? They're called 조선족. So we say that in English we're all Koreans, but actually, if we think about it, this so-called Korean diaspora, we don't even share the same term for what we call in English Korean. So I think it's even in that sense, literally, it's very much an identity in construction, and it still sounds very strange to call an ethnic Korean living in U.S. or anywhere abroad and call them 한국 사람, right? It's only after they come to South Korea and acquire South Korean citizenship it's okay to call them 한국 사람. But it's otherwise, we don't have that term for Korean. So let me go through this history, long history, but I'll try to be brief as possible, of this great journey that Koreans have started. And it actually started with the end of the Joseon dynasty. Because I think if you ask Koreans of about 120, 150 years ago what it means to be Korean, I think there are a very clear set of values, institutions, customs, traditions that undergird it, and they largely shared and very easily could identify as Korean. But I think it's since the fall of the Joseon dynasty that we really have been struggling to find this. And what I'm trying to, what I'll try to go through is the various ways in which Koreans, in the aftermath of the fall of the Joseon dynasty, try to search for a new way to incorporate this thing, this people or this whatever, this nation that we, in English again, we call Korean. So let me just, this is the long table of contents of what I'll try to say today. I'll start with the traditional Confucian order, a little bit about the opening of the country, the modernization, and then I go through 4 or 5 different ways, I think, that we have been struggling and we still continue to struggle in terms of what it means to be Korean, what should be the essence of a modern Korean identity. So I go through, and being a political scientist, I try to be very blunt politically and say, for instance, pro-China Wijeongcheoksa faction. This is what we call the traditional Confucians. But then if you look at it, given that the center of the Confucian universe was China, and that Qing dynasty was, of course, was still in existence then. So if you look at the political allegiance of these people who call for the preservation of traditional Confucian order, I say they're actually pro-Chinese in a modern geopolitical sense, Japanese, unashamedly so. Pro-US Christian faction is another one, with many, many Christians amongst us here, and my family included. My grandfather converted to Christianity in 1915, and of course, Christianity back when my grandfather did it, or even here. Pro-Soviet Communist faction, ethnic nationalists, and then I'll try to bring it all together. How all these different factions or different modes of being Korean. And what today I think how these things are now coming together under a new global standard, and perhaps we're seeing the emergence of a more comprehensive, coherent modern Korean identity. Let me quote you this. Oh, 죄송합니다, 윤 회장님. 이거 your diary. This is a very famous diary from Yoon Chi-ho, who is of Korea. Now, this was written in his diary in 1893, and I'm trying to show you this because I'll just read this. If I had the means to choose my home at my pleasure, Japan would be the country. I don't want to live in China with its abominable smells, or in America, sorry, mistype, where racial prejudice and discrimination hold their horrid sway, or in Korea, as long as its infernal government lasts. Oh, blessed Japan, the paradise of the East, the garden of the world. This was what many, 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 vast majority of Asian or even non-European thinkers everywhere, including India, everybody thought this, because Japan was the only non-Western country that was modernizing, and it was a shining beacon. And especially for Koreans who were suffering under this long, decrepit old regime, this was the model to aspire to. And this really is actually quintessential tragedy of Korea, being a modern reformist Korean, because the model that so many enlightened Koreans aspire to then, of course, became the colonizer. So how do you deal with your best model? The one that you aspire to is the one that colonizes you, right? Takes away your sovereignty and then tries to take away your identity. So how do you deal with this duality of what Japan is for you? Right? So traditional Confucian order, let me just quickly go through this. Heungseon Daewon-gun, Prince Regent, who is the father of next to the last king of Joseon dynasty. He came to power in a really very dramatic fashion, but can't go into that. He was in power as the father of the king, as the regent from 1864 to 1873. And what he did was he tried to revive this dying dynasty. And I think another tragedy for the Joseon dynasty was that he was actually partly successful. Look at the dates again, 1864 to 1873. These are the dates when what happens in 1868 in Japan. That's when the Meiji Restoration starts. So this is when China and also Japan starts to undergo major westernization. Whereas in Korea, because he was such a successful politician, actually, he was actually able to preserve, reconstruct the traditional order, which would last much longer than in China or in Japan. And one symbol of it, of course, is Gyeongbokgung. This is the palace that he had rebuilt. The palace itself had lain in ruins since the Hideyoshi invasion of 1892. And for nearly 3 centuries, it was lying in ruins. He actually rebuilt this incredible palace, which again, then the Japanese destroyed much of it during the occupation, and now the government is trying to rebuild as much of it as possible. The traditional order is the family, royal family. The 2 symbols of the dynasty, the traditional order was Jongmyo, the royal family shrine, and Sajik, the temple to gods of grain and earth, which is very close by. So literally, the Koreans, when they refer to their state, they refer to it Jongmyo Sajik. So royal family shrine was the traditional Confucian paternalistic order, which embodied which the royal family, like all other families, embodied. And in this sense, every clan, every family in Korea had actually their own shrine, family shrine. It's just that royal shrine was bigger. But in that sense, they're first among equals. What distinguished the royal family from the rest of the family is that they not only performed rituals to their ancestors, they represented all the families and went to Sajik, the temple of gods, temple to gods of grain and earth, and then so they connected all the clans with earth, right? And that was the role of the royal family. Otherwise, everybody lived in clan villages. The most famous Andong Hwae folk village, I'm sure many of you have visited. Another would be Wolseong Yangdong E clan family folk village. But interesting thing about the Korean word is that when they used to call the people, what we now call the people, they called it Baeksong, Manbaek. Song means last name or clan, family. Baeksong literally just means 100 surnames. But actually, there were more than 100 surnames. There are like 258 surnames in Korea, actually. So they called it, when they wanted to call all the people, they said, Man means 10,000. So it's 10,000, 100 families. It means all the people. So the basic unit of the state was the surname, the last family. So everybody lived in these clan villages. And then on the top of that ladder was the royal family, which again, they prayed to their ancestors, but at the same time, then they represented all the people, and when they connected the whole people to the gods of earth and grain. Now, what about, so this is all part of the Sinic order, because the Chinese, the emperor of China was called the Son of Heaven. And he represented all the people, including the Korean people. Right? So what distinguished an emperor from a king was that, as I was just saying, the Korean king prayed to the gods of earth and grain. The emperor, or the Son of Heaven, then represented all these princes, all these princely states, and then he represented them as the Son of Heaven and went to the temple of heaven to pray. Right? So he was the one sole connection to heaven. Right? So that was the hierarchical Sinic world order. So they had a temple of heaven. They still have a temple of heaven in China. The Meiji Restoration in China, and then in Korea, only when Daewon-gun was forced out of power and his son King Gojong starts to rule in his own name, and it starts in 1876, and we have the first modern treaty. First modern style treaty, opening of the ports into the race. They learned things very, very quickly, and they came to Korea, and they forced this modern treaty on Korea, and Korea signed it in 1876. So This is the collapse of the Sinocentric order. But what happened in Korea, Shinmiyangyo was which one? There was basically there were two, Shinmiyangyo and Pyeonginjangyo. Okay, so there were two. Koreans fought two major battles just before they opened up, and one was with the United States and one was with France. And in a sense, Korea actually won, or they thought they won both battles. Now, the French came, and they came to Ganghwa Island, and they tried to force the Korean government to open and sign a modern treaty. The Korean government refused. There was a major battle. The French won, but they just said, these Koreans are just too ferocious. We're not going to deal with them anymore. We have better places to go than Korea. So they went south. So they focused on Vietnam. In the meantime, of course, this is when when they invaded the Ganghwa Island. There was the repository of the royal documents, which then they took with them, and which were returned very, very recently to Korea. And that's when it happened. The other major battle was the General Sherman, which was a merchant marine ship of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, actually came to Korea, and it sailed up the Taedong River, which flows through Pyongyang. And it went all the way up to Pyongyang, and they wanted to start trade with Korea. And Koreans refused. And one thing led to another, and an angry mob started to attack the ship. And the ship got caught in a low tide. The ship, all the people on the ship were killed. The ship was burnt. Koreans thought, because they thought that it was a British ship, they had reported to the Chinese, the Qing government, but nobody knew what was going on. The Pacific Fleet, U.S. Pacific Fleet, searched for the General Sherman for a whole year. They had absolutely no idea what had happened. And eventually they found out, so they sent a punitive expedition, and they had a huge battle on Ganghwa Island again. But after a ferocious battle, Koreans suffered much more bigger casualty, but again, United States decided not to bother with Korea anymore. So both times, Taewon-gun, the Prince Regent, thought that we were successful in expelling the barbarians, whereas the Japanese and the Chinese were not, right? So that's one reason, this unfounded confidence in the security of the traditional order that actually delayed Korea's opening much further than in the case of the other countries. So for instance, we have many traditionalists, such as Myeonam Chae-kyun, who really tried to, who symbolized the traditional order. And many of you, I'm sure, saw the movie Last Samurai, made by, how many of you saw Last Samurai, made by, what's his name, Tom Cruise, right? It's a great movie. And I call him the Last Sunbi because if you make a movie out of him, you'll make a much better movie than The Last Samurai. Because this guy really epitomized the kind of the samurai in that movie as well, the Korean version of it. Except that, of course, the Korean version was a literati, not a swordsman, right? So he was a literati who opposed modernization at every turn. But in 1905, when Japan imposed the Protectorate Treaty on Korea, only the traditional Confucianists rose up and actually undertook military means to try to defend the nation's sovereignty. Of course, they were no match for the modern Korean and combined Korean, especially Japanese military. But he even at the age of 74, 1905, he raises an army, traditional army, and fights the Japanese. He refuses to fight against the Koreans who came with the Japanese. He's captured, he's sent in exile. He was so revered in Korea, he could not be exiled and sent to prison within Korea. So they sent him to the island of Tsushima. And he stayed there for 3 months, and he refused to eat the food supplied by his Japanese captors, and he died. So he was brought back to Korea, and the nation actually mourned his death. So this was certainly, he was a traditionalist. Now again, so I'm not going to go through this part of it, but Japan undergoes an incredible transformation, and the story of Meiji Restoration just is one of those rare instances in human history where such fundamental reform of a traditional society can take place in such a successful and such a short manner. But this is what was happening right next door, and this is what many Koreans try to learn from. I won't go to all these people, but I'll try to come back to it maybe later on, how the Meiji Restoration became a model for many Koreans. Anyway, so Korea, King Gojong started to reign in his name starting in 1873 and 1907 till 1907. I just mentioned the Unyang incident, the Japanese battleship that came and opened the port in Korea for the first ever modern treaty. And in 1881, Korean government for the first time sends a delegation to learn from the outside world, and they send one to China and one to Japan. The one to China, very few people even know about it because it was very, very unsuccessful. Whereas the one that went to Japan, actually the people who went on this particular mission had eventually played a very, very important role. There were so many people who were opposed to even people going to Japan to learn anything. So they actually had to disperse. They secretly met. They traveled individually, met in Busan, and went to Japan and did a very quick tour, came back. But the modernist, Fukuzawa Yukichi, who took these Koreans under his wing and trying to teach them what modernization was and all that. And of course, Yoon Chi-ho, whose diary that I was just quoting, he was able to Japan reformist faction. Many who eventually, and we will come back to a lot of them. So remember I just said in 1881 they send this modernizing mission to try to learn from the Japanese. 1 year later, in fact, when many of them were on their way back, basically from Japan, there's a rebellion by the traditionalist faction in Korea, and this is actually the photo of the first ever modern. Probably these were rifles from the U.S. Civil War, actually, and they were being trained by Japanese officers. Right? And Mr. Yoon Chi-ho actually had a major role in setting this up and training them as well. Now, when this rebellion took place, you see, the Koreans were leaning towards Japan. And so what the Chinese decided to do was that they thought Korea was leaning too far towards Japan, and they wanted an opportunity to intervene. And when this military rebellion took place, and the modernizing faction was purged, the queen, who had to escape the rebellion and hid herself in South, she was enterprising enough to send somebody to China and to urge the Chinese to intervene. So the Chinese were only too happy to oblige, and Yuan Shikai, of course, who later on becomes the president of the Republic of Korea, of China, at the time comes to Korea as at the head of about an army of about 3,000, and he quickly quells the rebellion. But he stays in Korea for about 10 years, largely ruling Korea until about 1894. There's a radical reform party. So the same people, these people who went to Japan in 82, 81, they saw this rebellion, and saw Korea falling back into under the direct control of the Chinese, then decide they can't wait and they stage a coup. Right? And this is the building that is in Anguk-dong, which many of you will pass by all the time. It's in Anguk-dong today. And this is the first modern post office. And it was at the inauguration of this modern post office that these modernizers staged this coup. Now, the coup fails after only 3 days. And the top leaders of it, Kim Ok-gyun, Park Yong-hyo, and Seo Jae-pil, and most other coup leaders, they all flee the country. But we're going to come back to this, and this is why I want to go tell you what happened to them. Their family, they escaped, but all their family members were either executed or imprisoned because they were treason. They were committed family members of somebody who committed treason. So Kim Ok-gyun and 3 generations of family members were executed. His father, Kim Byung-tae, was jailed for 10 years and then put to death at the same time. Kim Ok-gyun's slain body was brought back from Shanghai and dismembered. His younger brother died in prison. His mother and elder sister committed suicide, tried to commit suicide. His sister didn't succeed, survived, and then she disappeared. We don't know. Same thing happened, fate had befallen Seo Jae-pil and other modernizers. So what I'm trying to tell you is that as far as the modernizing factions are concerned, Korea is backtracking. It's going backwards. And every time they try to modernize, something horrible happens. And there's this reaction from the traditional government. So, again, this is 1889, Yoon Chio. To me, the question of Korean independence is of no concern. With a government like the present one, independence will bring no relief to the nation. On the other hand, with a better government, a government that will take patriotic and sympathetic interest in the welfare of the people, even dependence is no real calamity. Besides, a healthy and prosperous nation may at any time recover its independence. But a people kept poor, ignorant, and weak by weak, poor, ignorant, and outrageously selfish government, what good will independence do to such a people? And this may be stretching it a little bit, but if there is anybody in North Korea today who is trying to do something to bring about some kind of change within North Korea, this might actually be what that person is saying about Kim Jong-il regime. So what I'm trying to say is that for us nowadays, who are baptized in very, very anti-Japanese modern historiography, this is a treasonous thing to say. But this was 1889. This was before the occupation. And still for them, this was something, you can't say this now, right? Independence, good or bad, you need to be independent and sovereign. And that's what North Korean regime is saying, actually, to their people, right? But this is something that really gives us pause. Nothing seems to be more absurd and foolish for anyone to be deceived by. Now, why Japan, right? Why Japan and why not the United States? And this really gets because nothing seems to be more absurd and foolish for anyone than to be deceived by the boastful pretensions of the Americans. But in practice, the Americans have shown that their doctrine of equality, etc., is only skin deep. 1889, right? A Korean is writing this. That is, if you want to enjoy the so-called inalienable right of man in this quote-unquote land of freedom, you must be white. The persecution of the Chinese, I do not blame for a moment the national or racial prejudice of the Americans, but I do blame the perfect inconsistency between their acts full of the basest prejudice and their doctrine full of the loftiest and never to be realized Catholicity. Right? And because after the coup of 1884, coup, back in the middle of, was just right after the Chinese Exclusion Act. This was after the completion of the transcontinental railway, and all of a sudden they discovered they had 50,000 coolies, Chinese, who had been forced laborers, but then suddenly they had no use for them. So they said, okay, no more immigration. So does the US reopen immigration to the East? And this even applies to the Japanese. So they run smack into this prejudice, and except for one, Seo who goes on to Philadelphia and goes to medical school and becomes the first Korean ever to acquire medical license and starts practicing medicine in the United States, all of them come back. They come back to Japan. He says, we can't stay in San Francisco. This is ridiculous. The Japanese, at least they don't treat us like this. They treat us much better. So Park Young-hyo, they all go back to Japan, right? And spend their next 10 years in Japan. In the meantime, by 1894, 10 years after the Chinese Yuan Shikai comes to Korea, there's the domestic situation that just becomes untenable, and there's a massive uprising in Korea, and this is a local indigenous religion called Donghak, which is now called Cheondogyo, and some of you may have seen the Suun Hwaegan in Angukdong. Now, I'm not going to read this one. This is a manifesto by one of the leaders of this Donghak rebellion, and the reason I quote this is actually it shows you a completely different, still very, very traditional Confucian worldview, not the modernizing worldview. And so even the rebellion itself is very, very much in the traditional vein of things. And so what happens is that when the uprising takes place, the Joseon government is unable to quell the rebellion. So they already have 3,000 Qing soldiers in Korea, who, by the way, were stationed at, guess, where was their garrison? At Yongsan, right? Which is where they started first. And of course, when the Japanese came later, that became a Japanese garrison. That's why the 8th Army compound has so many Japanese buildings still left. They try to maintain at very low cost, so they maintain these old Japanese colonial era buildings in the 8th Army compound. But anyways, so they come. The Japanese also decide to join. They come and they very quickly quell the rebellion, but then neither side wants to leave. And so they have this big debate, you go first, no, you go first, and neither side decides to leave. And so what they do is they start a war, and it's called the Sino-Japanese War, and the biggest battle is fought in Pyongyang. So Korea becomes the battleground for this. Yinchio Diary. The battles of Marathon and Salamis preserved Grecian independence. The Saracenic conquest in Europe received its fatal blow at the hands of Charles Martel. These are regarded among the momentous events in history, for upon them depended the question of whether Asiatic conservatism or European progress should rule the world. The present war, this is the Sino-Japanese War he's talking about, is more than a conflict between the regenerating civilization of the West and the degrading barbarism of the East. The success of Japan would mean the salvation of Korea and the reformation of China. The reverse would plunge the Peninsula Kingdom into bottomless pit of Chinese corruption, while the Celestials would be confirmed in their belief that the empire needs no renovations. For the good of the whole East, may Japan succeed. You see how the intellectuals were thinking at that time. So the Japanese win the war. They install a pro-Japan modernizing government, and they start undertaking these great reforms, which is a literal copy of the Meiji Restoration reforms. I'm not going to read that one. But when the Japanese power becomes too influential, the Queen Min starts to engage the Russians. So they bring in Russian advisors. So she knows what balance of power. She knows how to play real politics here, right? But of course, the Japanese are not happy. And in 1895, they blatantly, in the early morning, invade the palace with a band of samurai ronin, and they slay her, along with all the other courtesans, because they all claim to be Queen Min, and they could never identify who was the real queen. So they killed everybody and burnt her body. And this is the spot that still marks it. So when this incident happens, and the year later, you can see her husband, King Gojong, is terrified, is scared of his life. That something, the Japanese might do this again to him too. So what does he do? He runs away. He takes his court and he runs away to the Russian legation, which is right next, which is, we're all talking about Cheongdong. It's this little area, Toksu Palace in Cheongdong. It's this area that we all are very familiar with. So he runs in there. Japanese modernizing reforms are rescinded. The modernizers are all kicked out. They all go on yet another exile to Japan. Until when? Until 10 years later. Finally, where we are today, literally. I told you about Dr. Sojepil, Dr. Sojepil, who was one of the Kapshin coup leaders, whose wife committed suicide. His 2-year-old son died of starvation because nobody would hear. Reforms taking place under the Japanese guidance in 1895. He sold everything he had, and he came back to Korea because he thought there was hope. And he started this thing called the Independence Association. And he wrote first modern newspaper in Korea, first Korean newspaper in vernacular Korean, first Korean newspaper in the US. He started it all. And he built this Arch of Independence, which is in Sodaemun. You still see it when you go towards Yonsei University from downtown, right? And they built it at the side of a gate which was used to greet the imperial emissaries from China. Because that big hill in front of, behind Dongyemun, the Muakje Hill, that's the directest route to China. That's the route by which imperial emissaries would arrive in Seoul, and the king or somebody very high up in the Korean court would have to go out to this gate to greet them. So they destroy the gate and they build this Arch of Independence. And the Arch of Independence, I asked all my Korean students, this is 1896. So independence from whom? Because we all assume when you ask them an Arch of Independence, it's got to be from the Japanese. Well, that doesn't happen until half a century later, independence from Japan. This was started in 1896. So what's the independence from? Independence from China, right? Because the Sino-Japanese War, the Treaty of Shimonoseki, which settled the war, the first clause, very first clause, says Korea is no longer a vassal state of China, but an independent sovereign state. So actually, the Korean modernizers, reformers, were celebrating Korean independence, from China, which was brought to them by the Japanese. Right? That's why the Arch of Independence, the Japanese did not tear it down during the Japanese occupation. If it symbolized the Korean independence from Japan, they would most definitely have destroyed it, but they didn't, because it symbolized what? Japanese contribution to independence of Korea from China. In 1897, so what happens is that Emperor King Gojong finally, okay, so he now says, all right, he gets it now. What is a modern sovereign state? We have to be independent. We can't be a vassal state of China. We can't be a vassal of anybody. We have to be a sovereign state. So what does it mean to be an independent state? He thought very traditionally. He said, well, there's a German emperor, there's a Chinese emperor, the Japanese have an emperor, the British have an emperor, they all have emperors. So what does it mean to be a sovereign state? Well, I should become an emperor. And Korea should be an empire, become an empire. So he decides to found the Korean Empire, Daehan Empire. And he says, what do we need to do an empire? What did I tell you about the Temple of Heaven? For Gojong, what it meant to be a sovereign state and an empire was that I need to have my own Temple of Heaven because I am now a son of heaven as well. So what does he do? He orders the construction of this massive Temple of Heaven, right? And does that building right there look familiar to you? Right? Literally? It's right outside, right? So this was a temple of heaven built by King Gojong, where he ascended the throne to become the emperor Gojong. Right? 1904, finally the Japanese, there's a war, again, for the control of over the Korean peninsula between Russia and Japan. But war between the races, I won't go through it, that one. Actually, I should, just to offend everybody. The meanest Japanese would be a gentleman and a scholar compared to a vodka-drunk Orthodox Russian. If there are any Russians, sorry, this was a long time ago. Between a Japanese and a Korean, there's a community of sentiment and of interest based on the identity of race, of religion, and of written characters. Japan, China, and Korea must have one common aim, one common policy, one common ideal, to keep the Far East the permanent home of the yellow race and to make that home as beautiful and happy as nature has it meant to be. This is an era of racism. Everybody is defining those in terms of race. And so why not the Asians, right? So in 1905, what happens? Japan imposes a protector treaty, meaning they take away Korean sovereignty. And people like An Jung-un, a devout Catholic, right, and a reformer, says that he modern Japan, Prime Minister of Japan, is going to meet the Prime Minister of Russia. So he goes and, of course, he shoots and assassinates Ito Hirogumi. Right? And I always say the greatest symbol of modern Japan and the greatest symbol of Korean nationalism, one kills the other and is executed for it. And the judge asked him why. He said, because Ito betrayed the Asian race. He said that China, Japan, and Korea should all unite together and we should build this Asian community. With Japan leading, I have to kill him. Right? Reformists and Christianity. So, after the Japanese take over, then the reformists suddenly then have to say, okay, what do I do now? Do I still support Japan? So now they have to struggle with, okay, my nation's sovereignty. And in a sense, the Japanese are bringing the modern reform that they had always longed for, but in a much more direct sense than they had counted on. So a lot of them convert to Christianity, despite the fact that they still think America is a horridly racist country, but they think there's something about Christianity that they won't compromise them, right, with the Japanese. This is an alternative way of thinking. So they all convert to Christianity. Yun Chio, the earliest, 1887, a study at Shanghai Southern Methodist University, where he can. But many of Korea's leading politicians, leading independence fighters, the greatest Korean, we call them first, and the greatest modern Korean novelist, Lee Kwang-soo. They all converted to Christianity. Many of them actually left for the US. They said Korea is no longer, there's no sovereignty here, so we leave. So they left in 1900, An Chang-ho, Dosak, Sojepil, 1884. It never came back, as I said, until much later. And Seungman Rhee in 1904. Right? They all convert to Christianity before they leave for the US. And this is what Dosan An Chang-ho says in 1919, in March of 1919. Under the will and guidance of God. He's speaking in Los Angeles, right, to the Korean community in Los Angeles. The early version of the Koreatown and K-Town in LA. Under the will and guidance of God, I will continue the movement until either my death or independence. From now on, we will prepare to raise the public awareness regarding the matter and to reveal the situations where Korean Christians are being suppressed. Let us ask the Christian community in the United States to pray for us. If we do this, it will bring awareness in America to our situation, and those who sympathize with us will be able to help us. It is a responsibility that we, Korean Americans, should bear because it is part of diplomacy. So everybody starts going everywhere to start their own fight for independence. Another group, Lee Dong-hui was a commander in the modern Korean army. When the Japanese took over, he continued to fight. And then when he was finally forced to leave, he exiled himself to Manchuria. In 1917, this great event called the Bolshevik Revolution takes place in Russia. And all of a sudden, all these oppressed people suddenly find this beacon of hope, right? Which is Russia, communism. And in fact, Lenin sends 300,000 rubles to Lee Dong-hee, which is a huge sum of money at the time. And so they start the communist movement. Last but not least, Shin Che-ho. There are some people who then said that we don't want the Japanese version of modernism. We don't want the American Christian version of Koreanness. We don't want the Soviet, pro-Soviet communist version. And we don't want the traditionalist Chinese Confucian version either. What does it mean to be Korean? Well, Korean just means to be pure-blooded Korean. So they go for racism the way everybody was going for it. So they start creating a Korean modern ethnocentric, Korean race-centric historiography. And the great scholars are Park Eun-sik and Shin Che-ho. And one other thing is that they create a Manchuria-centric worldview. They think the northern Pyongyang area in Manchuria is a heartland, homeland of Korean ethnic identity, and rather than Shilla. And we still have this battle in Korean historiography. And in fact, if you look at it, Manchuria-centered, Pyongyang-centered, struggle for Korean independence, all of that is the discourse that Kim Il-sung completely usurps for himself. Division of Korea usurps for himself. Division of Korea after the Cold War, after the independence, we are still divided. It's US versus USSR. US pro-Christian faction versus pro-Soviet communist faction, Lee Seung-man versus Kim Il-sung, right? Nationalist issues all arise. Pro-Japan, pro-US, pro-Soviet, all these words are still very, very bad words in Korea. 친일파, 친미파, right? In English, it sounds pretty innocuous. Last but not least, let me just go through this. So what does it mean to be Korean? And I always say that the reason Korean nation, what we call the Korean nation, survived to this day is because Koreans were so quick in figuring out what the global standard, the reigning global standard is, and we absorb it. When Tang Dynasty becomes Buddhist, Shilla, Goguryeo, Baekje, they all become Buddhist. And the most Buddhism of all, Shilla, actually unifies the country in alliance with Tang Dynasty. Right? During the Joseon Dynasty, Ming Dynasty becomes the first Confucian dynasty in China. It is established in 1368. In 1392, Joseon Dynasty established itself as a Confucian dynasty. And it transformed a 1,500-year-old Buddhist country into a completely Confucian country, literally overnight. And all the great reforms, and I actually say that even the invention of Hangul, for instance, by King Sejong, is all a part of this effort to try to change this quintessentially Buddhist country into this completely new civilization based upon Confucianism. When Korea fails to reform, figure out what the global standard is, we become colonized. We lose our independence. What is happening in North Korea now? When South Korea is opening up and absorbing the global standard like nobody else, right? We send more students abroad to the US, to anywhere, to China. In proportion to the population, there's no comparison, right? They say there are roughly, 130,000 Chinese students studying in the United States now, about 120,000 Indian students studying in the United States. Now, according to the official statistics, maybe only about 100,000 South Korean students. But think of the population, right? Think of the population. So we are now succeeding in this South Korea, which became independent only in 1948, is undergoing this massive transition, reshaping ourselves into this new, according to this new global standard, capitalism or free market economy and democracy, and we are actually succeeding where the North Korea is not, right? And when people say that, Koreans have to speak English nowadays, we're obsessed with English, and everybody spends so much money trying to teach English to our kids, and all the social issues that goes with this, right? And I said, why do we, a lot of Korean nationalists would tell you, why do we have to struggle with this foreign language? Why can't we just use Korean? I told them, look, we were never monolingual. We were always bilingual. For thousands of years, think of Joseon Dynasty, think of the Buddhist Sutra, Goryeo Dynasty. What were all of our historical records written in? They were all written in classical Chinese. And the amazing thing about it is that, of course, the famous annals of the Joseon Dynasty, which if you ever get a chance ever to see it, go visit it in 한국학중앙연구원. It's based upon a verbatim record of the king's conduct of business, because all the Joseon Dynasty kings, they could only conduct state business when they had two scribes who were present. So one scribe wrote down everything that was being said verbatim. The other scribe wrote down the actions. So what happened was that the kings themselves could never look at the record. It's only after that they died, his son or the next king would form a committee. They would go through all the records, destroy whatever is not usable, and they would compile the official record. There's only one Korean king in history who actually forced himself way into the document center and took a look at what was written about him, and he was kicked out, and that's the 10th king, Yeonsan, right? Now, what I'm saying is that these King Sejong was conducting his state business in Korean. But his scribes were taking verbatim record of this in what? In classical Chinese. One is a phonetic, he was doing it in ideograph, right? There was no phonetic link even. So Koreans had this marvelous bilingual ability all the way through, right? Under the Japanese occupation, of course, Koreans spoke the best Japanese, right? Went to the best Japanese high schools and universities. So I think the incredible success of Korea actually is how quickly we find what sometimes we fail. But 1919, 1917, they decide to have a exhibition of Korean goods, because they wanted to show off to the world what a good job they had been doing ruling Korea. So they're looking for this space for exposition, and they couldn't find a wide enough space. So what do? They go back to the Gyeongbok Palace, and they promptly destroy a front third of the palace, right? And they create a huge open area there, and they hold the exhibition. And in order to house the crown prince who is coming to Korea to do the honors of cutting the tape, what do? They said, there's no modern hotel for our crown prince. So what do? They destroy the Temple of Heaven. And they build the first Western-style hotel here, which is the Chosun Hotel, right? Chosun Railway, Chosun Cheoldo Hotel, anyways, right? So that's why today only that remains. And ever since then, this has been the prime spot for the best hotel in Korea. So, I mean, all of this history is very, very much alive. It's actually literally inscribed in our city, and still, even in terms of our mentality, it very much affects us. And in a sense, we're still searching for identity, but I think there's a little beacon of hope that we may actually be getting somewhere. We're actually becoming a bit more confident about our identity, a bit more with the recognition coming from abroad as well, of course. But it's been a very, very long struggle, and I think we still have some ways to go, at least until unification. Sorry about being so long-winded. Let me stop there.